State's office is warning residents about another round of scam texts. The messages say unless the recipient pays their fine that day or the following day, their driver's license and vehicle registration would both be suspended. The text also states the recipient would face a toll service referral, legal prosecution, and credit rating damage, and there was a link to click included in the message. The Secretary of State's office says you should never click a link in an unsolicited text or email and never provide identifying or financial information in response to such messages. They say legitimate government agencies will rarely contact people by text for sensitive matters.